Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Practitioner Scholar, a Penn Chief Learning Officer podcast. I am your host, Julio Zelaya. To familiarize you, for those who don't know, the PennCLO is an executive doctoral degree program through the University of Pennsylvania's Graduate School of Education. The course of study focuses on organizational learning and leadership and development within the public and private working sectors. It is also known as a Scholar Practitioner program, where there is an academic research component, meaning what is learned can be applied to the workplace through best practices. I'm a current student of the program, and our guest is an alumna of the program. In this edition, we will meet Dr. Milana Hogan. Our guest today is a distinguished executive with over 17 years of experience in legal talent development and management. Currently, the Chief Talent Officer at Sullivan and Cromwell, LLP. She brings extensive knowledge from the legal industry. Her impressive background includes a doctorate in work-based learning and development from the University of Pennsylvania, the PennCLO program, a BA in political science from Brown University, and she has held key positions in major law firms such as Sullivan and Cromwell and Milber LLP, overseeing talent development and legal assistance services. Her unique blend of expertise in strategic leadership, team building, and evidence-based decision-making has been crucial in her leadership roles across the legal environment. I'm looking forward to today's podcast, and the words that come to mind are grit and growth. Welcome, Dr. Hogan. Can I call you Milana?
Please call me Milana, and thank you so much for agreeing to host, Julio. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Same here. So today's topic, a very exciting one. It's grit and growth. And let me tell you more. Our topic is the role of grit and growth mindset in women's lawyer success. And we're in for a treat today. We'll be speaking with a researcher who has conducted a groundbreaking study on this very topic. Her findings are truly enlightening. And she discovered that grit, defined as perseverance and passion for long-term goals, and a growth mindset, the view that one's basic abilities can be developed through dedication and hard work, are common traits among highly successful women lawyers. Interestingly, while women account for nearly half of the lawyers entering big law, there are significantly fewer positions. Our guest researcher will share insights on how these non-cognitive traits can be valuable predictors of future success for individual women lawyers in big law. It's a fascinating look at how law firms can potentially reduce the gender gap at the leadership level. And I can't wait to dig deeper into the details with her. So, Milana, introduce yourself a little. How do you find yourself in a classroom settings at the PennCLO doctoral program?
Sure. So I joined law firms right out of college. I went to Brown, as you said, and I majored in English and political science and thought that I would go on to become a lawyer. That was always my plan. I have lawyers in my extended family. I always admired what they did and thought I would one day do the same. But when it came time to actually apply to law school and go through that process, I got cold feet, you could say, or maybe I had a quarter life crisis, as people are calling it nowadays. And I thought, you know what? I like being around lawyers. I like the lawyer mindset, but I'm not sure that I actually want to do these legal tasks day in and day out. Instead, I think I want to work closely with them and help support them, but I'm not really sure I want to be a lawyer myself. So I started sort of looking around to see what sorts of jobs and opportunities would allow me to do that, to have sort of lawyer adjacency, if you will, where I would be close to them, but not have to be a practitioner myself. And I looked into a couple positions and found that the role of professional development really served that niche very well. It sort of allowed me that access. It allowed me the exposure. It allowed me to use some of the skills I had developed in undergrad. So that was not entirely a waste, those 4 years. And I found some great roles that allowed me to do that. And that was sort of the beginning. When I went to an industry conference with other people who were doing the same thing for lawyers, and I sort of looked to the people that were most impressive to me at those conferences, the people who I thought were doing this at the highest level, they all almost invariably had some sort of advanced degree. Either they themselves had been practitioners, so they had the benefit of that kind of real world experience, or they had some sort of advanced education degree. And so I thought, well, I've already ruled out law school. I've decided that's not the path that I'm going to take, but it would be really helpful to have an advanced degree in the education space so that when I'm working with lawyers and thinking about the lawyer brain and how it works and trying to create conditions in which lawyers can truly thrive, I will actually know something meaningful about that. I won't just be throwing spaghetti at the wall or delivering random acts of training. I'm going to be actually doing this in a thoughtful way. I'm going to have the ability to set and design and think about curriculum. I'm going to know the basics of learning theory, all of these things. So I felt like I really needed something else. And then I began the research process again, looking around what programs offer something in this space. And as soon as I was introduced to the Penn program, I thought, well, this is it. And I hadn't seen anything that was doing it at that level, with that level of instruction and thought leadership, and also, frankly, the quality of the other students. I went down to Penn to visit the program, and I sat in on a couple of classes as part of the leadership development module, and I was just completely blown away and frankly intimidated by the level of the discussion that was taking place in the classroom. It was just really and truly above and beyond what I had been hearing in other learning and development contexts. And I thought, this is totally the place for me. I think often if you're intimidated, it's a sign that you're in the right place. I knew that I had a lot to learn. I knew that I would be coming in and there would be a steep learning curve, but also that I would be surrounded by people who were doing this at a very high level. And so I thought this is definitely the right program for me.
So I love that the journey included being in a conference, which means you were already doing networking, you were already meeting very interesting people, and all of a sudden you see that those people have something in common. They have advanced degrees, and I love the term you use, adjacency. It's I can do things that are related to my core profession, but I can dig deeper, I can find evidence base. And then when you actually go to the program, you experience something that I think everyone has in the program, is that imposter syndrome. Like, I don't belong here. These people are amazing. These people are great. And I think that's also a great segue to your research, but that we'll dig deeper into that in a while. So this is a mid-degree, mid-career program. So people might have that question, how do I balance it all? I'm in a demanding job. I'm in a very important position in my company or in my business. What's your advice to those people who find, okay, maybe I won't be able to do this in a mid-career position?
Yeah, it's so interesting. And I think we all probably spend some time thinking about, is this going to be worth it? And can I get to the same place if I don't now take on this additional and very significant amount of work that's going to happen for all of us in the Penn program at the same time as we are also trying to manage these active careers. And in my case, a very young family as well. Mm-hmm. And so my advice to people who are thinking about doing it is definitely to just do it and not to do the math. I think if I had been really practical about this, frankly, and if I had sat down and tried to figure out, well, I'm going to need X number of days, a week to study, I'm going to have to fit it in. Sometimes the studying might take place. It might start at 10 p.m. and it might go until midnight because that's the first time when I've had time that I can legitimately devote to this. Sort of uninterrupted time is hard to find in a busy life. We all know that. So if I'd really sat down and tried to map it out, I don't think I would have said yes to it. And instead, this is an example of a time where I really let passion be my guide. And I said, I love this stuff. I know that I am going to love reading and learning. I know that I like learning. I know that I always loved school. And I know that whatever I learn here is really going to enrich me in a very meaningful way. And I think whenever you're studying something that you do love, that does sort of spark a natural interest in a space that is compelling to you in some way, it often feels less like work. So even if I did begin it at 10 o'clock, it felt like, oh, this is a pleasure read on some level, right? I'm reading a book that's really interesting, or an article, or I'm sort of digging into a project or thinking about some group work that we're doing and how we can do it at a better level. And I really found that. I really found that it sort of was in many ways kind of a well for me. I would go in and do this work and it would actually sustain me. And the other nice thing about it is that for me, and I think a lot of people in the program feel this way, it was immediately relevant. So I could read an article and then the very next day, I would find some way that it could connect to the work that I was doing in my professional role, right? Wearing my professional hat at Sullivan and Cromwell, I found, oh, yes, here's a connection, an immediate connection. And so because it's so closely related to what we are all doing day in and day out, I don't think it takes away. So I think don't do the math. That would be my advice. Don't try to calculate because you might get scared, but jump in and trust that they're going to feed one another.
So I love that you say just do it. And the other is follow your passion. And this, I think it's a great advice also for discovering your research topic in your dissertation. So you wrote about grit and growth mindset, and particularly in women lawyers. So can you talk to us about what led you to that topic in particular?
Yeah, absolutely. I remember this moment very clearly. It was sort of one of those aha moments that many of us have in the program. Angela Duckworth, Dr. Duckworth, who really is behind the construct of grit. She developed it while at Penn and went on to win a MacArthur Genius Award for her work in this space and continues to do incredibly interesting things. She came in to teach one of the modules as part of my own leadership development module. And the minute she came in and started talking, I really truly had this experience where I felt like alarm bells were going off. And I thought, oh my gosh, she is describing something that I have seen play out in the law firm context so many times. I've seen people demonstrate this trait, really bring that grit to bear, that passion and perseverance, but I never had a word for it. And suddenly she's describing this thing, and it's this moment of sort of recognition where you're like, yes, I totally relate to this. And everything you're saying makes sense to me on sort of a deeper frequency. And I was immediately sort of captivated by it, and then went on to really benefit from her module there. And I think a lot of people felt similarly about that particular module. It was just one of those ones that everybody sort of feels changed by on some level. So I had that experience, but then I started to think, well, how could I, turn this into something that might be useful in the legal profession? There had not been any research at that point about lawyers in particular and grit. There had been a lot of research in the academic context where it's very important, very relevant for all of our children. I actually use it in my own parenting constantly. I'm constantly trying to instill grit in my kids, my poor kids. But there really hadn't been too much about lawyers in particular. There had been grit research in a professional context, but not for lawyers in particular. So immediately I started to think, how can I convert this into something that will be relevant in this context? And ultimately what that became was, I need to be the researcher. I need to do this research. And lawyers love evidence. If anyone has any lawyers in their family or knows lawyers, they really want proof of some kind. And so that was really the underpinning of my study. It's like, how can I present to them what I already know sitting in this classroom, that grit is going to make a difference, but how can I prove that to them? And that became the basis of my study.
So I'm seeing common themes in our conversation. First is the value of networking and having those kind of mentors and people who spark that interest. And you begin to say, okay, this is very interesting. And you find those eureka moments, right? Where, oh, wow, she's talking about this. She's doing this research. And then following your own passions. You're talking about big law and going into being a lawyer and then focusing your study on this area in particular. So I'm very interested to know, what were your main findings? So the first study done on lawyers and on big firms, what did you find?
Yeah. So to tell you what I found, I'll say a word about how I set up the study. What I did was to send out a survey to women lawyers. I did a random sampling of law firms in the what is called the AmLaw 100, which is sort of recognized to be the top 100 law firms in the US. And I sent out a random sampling. I went to, with the help of a lovely intern who was earning some money for college, helped troll those websites and get email addresses of women lawyers at these firms, and sent out a study to them asking them to take the grit test and the growth mindset quiz, which was work that was done by Carol Dweck, who was at Stanford. So I sort of took those two existing scales. And then I also asked them a bunch of questions about various measures of success within the law firm context. So, for example, one of the measures of success would be how well are you doing on your annual performance evaluations? Almost all firms do some sort of annual performance assessment. And so I was asking them, how did you do on this? Are you getting good messages? Are they telling you you're doing well? Are they telling you there's room for improvement? Sort of what are they saying to you? So that's one measure of success. Are you on partnership track? That's how law firms work. It's really an up or out model, similar to consulting firms. And so we were looking at that as well. Are you on partnership track? Are they telling you that you're likely to become an owner of the firm? Are you doing all of those things that you need to do? And then I also looked at how hard are you working? Are you getting good assignments? Are they choosing you for the things that are real development opportunities? Or are they just giving you kind of the more basic and routine work? So those are some of the things that I was looking for as measures of success. And then what I did was really try to see, what is the data telling us here? Are there links, important links between grit and growth mindset, how you're showing up on these scales, and how you're actually performing when you're in the legal context? And not surprisingly, it's always nice to see this. You sort of have a moment, I think, in your dissertation where you hold your breath and you're like, are we going to find anything? Am I right? I really feel like I'm right, but who knows? And of course, as we all know, you have to just follow the data. So you might be wrong and you have to accept that and pivot if that's the case. It happens sometimes. But luckily here, what we found was very strong and statistically significant connections between grit and growth mindset and these various measures of success. So for example, with respect to grit, the higher you scored on a grit test, the more likely you were to perform better on your performance reviews. So the grittier people are doing better. They're getting better feedback from the firms about how well they're doing. You're more likely to be on partnership track. You're more likely to bill more hours, which, you know, is an interesting measure because that is something that law firms really do focus on, is how busy are you and how engaged. It's another way of thinking about engagement. And it was very clear that these traits matter. And so then we started to say from there, well, if they matter so much, right? And now we have our evidence, now we have our lawyerly proof, right, that they do matter. Now, how can we try to instill them? Because I think the best news about grit and growth mindset are these are mutable traits, which is to say they are within your control. You can become more gritty. Gritty is about really being, it's a sort of behavioral choice that you make. Am I going to dig in? Am I going to persist? How am I going to fuel that? Hopefully with passion, right? And so you can really try to amp those up. You can kind of turn that dial up on these traits. And so then we started to focus on, if they matter, how can we really emphasize them? So those are a couple examples of the finding.
So I was reading that you found also in your research that female lawyers are in the 80th percentile when it comes to grit. 80th percentile. That's very in the outer liar scope. So can you explain what that means in particular and what are the implications?
Sure. So that was a finding when we looked at the survey responses across the board. We had just a huge number of respondents and we were sort of doing the math on that. So what's the average grit score? What does that look like if you look at average grit scores for other populations of people who have already taken this test? And again, I said there's been a lot of work done in the academic setting, but also other professional settings. If you sort of compare, get into the business of comparing scores, female lawyers are very gritty. That's sort of the bottom line. And that wasn't super surprising to me because grit is often correlated with how high you advance from an academic perspective. So grittier people are more likely to go on to get advanced degrees, and the practice of law requires an advanced degree. You have to get the JD in order to practice law. And so that made sense to me intuitively. They have that skill set, they understand what it takes. And it's also really closely related to the nature of the work that you do when you're in a law firm. So often, especially for these top 100 law firms, they're dealing with really complex cases. It's not a routine traffic stop, right? This is a really complex case. Often it's a conflict between two businesses that are deeply complex, that have many different layers. And there usually is no obvious precedent. It's not, well, in this case, we rule this way or we rule this way. It's like, we don't really know. And we have to actually argue that it is this case or that it is similar to this other thing that wouldn't maybe seem similar to a lay person looking at this set of facts, right? So you really have to dig in. These cases can take years and years. We've had active matters at the firm that have been going on for years. It's not a quick fix, right? And so those same skill sets really apply. You have to bring them to bear in the practice of law, that persistence. And it's hard. It's hard work. And the best way to fuel hard work is with passion. So often you're reminding lawyers, we got to tap back into the why. Why are we doing this? And for so many people, it's because they wanted to help people, right? For so many lawyers, it's sort of this altruistic feeling and sort of the beginning of the practice of law, right? You're like, I want to help people who are in need in some way, right? And so you sometimes have to tap back into that to fuel that persistence and that very hard work. So yeah, that was a very clear finding that women lawyers are very gritty, and it didn't surprise me. But there's also lots of room for improvement. Even someone who is gritty, sometimes just hearing that does matter, it's like reinforcement for a good behavior. It's like when you're doing all the right things nutritionally, and then you read an article that says, yes, this is the right way to do it, and here's the science to prove it. Sometimes you're like, okay, good, I needed that. I was going to reach for the donut, but you're reminding me that, yes, protein is probably a better choice.
So that reminder, you're saying this reminds me of something. I think it's a great reminder also in the implications on the gender gap in big law firms. So how do you think your research can be applied to those leadership decisions to reduce the gender gap?
So one of the findings from that study was that grittier individuals are more likely to stay with their current organization, right? And that's because they are tapping into that passion. They are really persistent. They're often quite loyal. And so we found that for law firms who are really focused on this issue, which is really every law firm, I haven't encountered a law firm yet that says, who cares about the gender gap? Everybody's very focused on this. And so when you're looking at what are things that law firms can do to try to retain women lawyers, focusing on grit and also growth mindset are really critical, because for many women, they are experiencing challenges within their profession that make them question themselves. And we talked about imposter syndrome earlier in this program a little bit. Certainly I had my moment of that, like, oh my God, everyone in the room is smarter than me and they're all doing this at a higher level, and do I belong? And a lot of women lawyers feel that too. They will encounter something really difficult, or maybe they'll get some negative feedback about something that they did, and they'll sort of worry in their minds, do I have what it takes? And so you have people who are opting out for that reason. And that's really where this grit and growth mindset research comes in, is we sort of say, when you're having that moment, that's when we want you to use these tools, this idea of grit and how grit works over time, and this idea of growth mindset, which is this sort of, simply put, belief in the power of effort. If you really believe that you have and can, through deliberate effort and practice over time, improve your skill set, if you believe that to your core, then you're less likely to opt out and to say, I don't have what it takes, right? Because you know you have what it takes. And that effort over time really makes the difference. And that's more important than sort of any kind of base level of intelligence you have coming in. It's not about how smart you are. It's about how you approach difficult tasks, your resilience, how quickly can you bounce back, all of those elements, right? And so that's really where it comes in and becomes a very powerful tool. So when we've been talking to other law firms about this, and I've joined forces with the American Bar Association Commission on Women in the Profession, who sort of understandably loved these concepts, and it was very aligned with what they were trying to do with their work. So when we presented this to other law firms, we said, this is how we can do it, right? when people are thinking of opting out, we want to give them these tools, and we want to give them the tools even before they think of opting out, so that when they get to that moment, they already have the tools, they already know the research, they're familiar with this, and hopefully that reduces some of the departures, the premature departures that the profession is seeing.
And this is one of the things that I particularly find very powerful of the PennCLO program, is that it is not only doing research for research's sake, but it's very applied to very relevant organizational challenges. And I think you're showing a true example of this. So it has been several years since you published this study. And in our previous conversation, you were saying, this is something I talked to in my family. This has impacted my life, my role as a professional. How has this research shaped you as a person and your different roles that you're pursuing?
Well, it's funny. Somebody had described to me, a student in the Penn program who was a little bit ahead of us, had sort of talked about the dissertation process. They actually brought a couple of students back into the program to talk to us about sort of what this would look like. And I'm very grateful that they did that, because there was a lot of great advice in those conversations, and they really helped us get some good insight into what was ahead. But one of them was describing this as it's like this mountain, and you keep thinking you're at the top of it. You keep sort of looking up and you can see what you can see, and you think you're almost there. And then you get to the top and realize, nope, there's another peak behind it. And it can really feel sort of Sisyphusian in that way, where you're like, oh my gosh, I'm pushing this rock up this hill and I'm never going to get up to the top of the hill. And there definitely are moments that feel that way. And so in so many ways, this grit topic, the fact that my dissertation was on grit and growth mindset, was just like literally the perfect topic for that experience. Because when I would get to that stage, I think, no, I can do it. Effort is going to get me to the other side of this mountain. And I'm going to remind myself of why I'm doing it, of my why, my passion, why this matters to me, how I think this is going to help women in the profession more broadly. And so having that be the literal subject matter was incredibly helpful to me personally. I will also confess to being somebody that was not particularly growth mindset oriented before I began this process. And so I was sort of a convert along the way to the power of growth mindset in particular. I'd always been pretty gritty. I always had been willing to work hard. So that wasn't so much of a conversion, but definitely growth mindset. I believed that, I had a certain ceiling and I could perform up to my own ceiling, but I couldn't really do anything beyond that. And I think this experience really shattered that in many ways, my own perception of what my own limits were. The harder I worked, the better this dissertation got. And then sort of outside of that, the dissertation got some attention from the American Bar Association, Commission on Women in the Profession. They wanted to start something else with it. And that turned into a program that is actually celebrating its 10-year anniversary. This week, we're going to do a celebration tomorrow in New York City, have a bunch of people gathering to celebrate it. It turned into the Grit Project. And there's just been countless people impacted by that work. And that's so great. And that then turned into a book. The Grit Project turned into a book. And then that book turned into a second round of research, which is focused on not necessarily just grit in the individual, but grit in teams. And how do you bring grit into the team context? And how do you work with people in a collaborative and gritty way? And so it's just spun into all of these things. And I think it's just been sort of a real life example of these traits playing out, one thing leading to the next. And I myself have changed as a human being along the way. I do use them with my children. I can see it. I have a 13-year-old daughter, a teenage daughter now. And she's just beginning to confront some of those questions. Am I good enough? Do I have what it takes? How do I compare to other people? And so I keep saying it's not about that. It's about being your best self. And the way to be your best self is passion and perseverance and belief in the power of effort.
So I love that this conversation always focuses on following your passion and being yourself and bringing that authentic self to any encounter, to work, to life in general. So I love the analogy when you talk about this mountain. You're on top of this mountain. So let's use that analogy to look for the future. So congratulations, by the way, on everything that happened after your dissertation and your work. And now let's imagine the future. So the first mountain is big laws in general. What would be your advice to them? How do you improve the gender gap that exists in some big laws? And the other is to aspiring women lawyers. If they want to go to leadership positions in these companies, what would be your advice to both companies and to aspiring women lawyers?
Yeah, two great questions. Thank you for asking them. For companies, I would say you definitely want to make sure that you are nourishing and feeding people and creating environments in which they are going to thrive. And grit and growth mindset are two really important parts of any corporate culture. You want people to know that if they come to your organization and they work incredibly hard and they bring their whole self to work, and they bring everything that they are passionate about, that's going to be a recipe for success. You want them to know that they are going to thrive in that environment. And you also want to lead teams in particular with a growth mindset orientation. So you want people to know we are all here to learn. That's kind of what we're doing here. We're also here to execute certain tasks. Yes, of course. But ideally, in a very well-run organization, everybody is going to be learning something every day. We're all going to be here to get better and to improve and to learn new skill sets. And that's sort of the point of all of this. And anytime you're learning something, you're going to get it right some of the time and you're going to get it wrong some of the time. And a growth mindset oriented culture really looks at mistakes as opportunities for learning rather than individual shortcomings. And so I think that's something that organizations really need to focus on. 9 times out of 10, it's not that an individual is lazy or that they are just phoning it in or they don't care. 9 times out of 10, there's a problem with the process rather than the individual. And so I think taking it back to that, focusing on that in particular and sort of coming to this with the belief that most people want to do good work and be part of something that is well done. And they want to produce at the end of the day a really fine work product. And if you sort of give people the benefit of the doubt, and then create systems that support that, you tend to get really good performance. So that's definitely what I would say to companies. Don't overlook these traits. They're so critical in terms of creating this kind of environment where people are really going to perform at the highest level and sustain that over time and retain people who are of that same mindset, right? Like is attracted to like. So you want to make sure that your environment is reflective of those skill sets. And then for individual women just starting out, we had our first year class of associates start last week. Many firms similarly have their new incoming classes of lawyers starting in the fall. And it's such a critical time for all of them. And I think for many young women lawyers, and this is not gender specific, it's true of male lawyers as well, a lot of times when they arrive at the law firm, it's the first time where they've ever really been challenged. A lot of them were very good at performing well academically. So a lot of them sort of sailed through high school and college and law school, and they did really well on the LSAT and all these sort of measures of success that get you to the starting line. I'm sure many of them confronted personal conflicts. I'm not talking about that. I'm more talking about sort of academically, it hasn't been for many of them, as challenging. And then they get to this level and suddenly it's the first time where it ever is really hard to do well. And they really sort of think, oh, now I don't know what to do because I haven't confronted this feeling. I'm used to being at the top of my class. And now what? Now what do I do with that? So I think for many of them, it's important to recognize that this is a feeling shared by everybody, all genders, all levels within law firms. We all sort of wonder, are we capable or can we solve this problem? We all have that moment. And I think just knowing that you are not alone is a really helpful thing for especially young women to bear in mind, that we've all been in that place and we've all found ways to navigate through it. And the more effort and passion and perseverance, again, you put into this, the more likely you are to succeed. So the earlier you can practice that, the better. In fact, great. If you're confronted with a moment where you're not quite sure what to do, that is a perfect opportunity to try to build some of these skills, even if you haven't had to use them until this point in your life. So I would say for all of them, yes, you're not alone. We're all in this together, and effort and passion and practice and perseverance all really work. I promise. I have evidence and proof.
And I rest my case.
And I rest my case. Exactly.
Yes.
Bang the gavel. Exactly.
Bang. So I find this summary very reflective also on what the PennCLO program looks like. I think it's a safe place where we can find very talented individuals, but we can be authentic. And you brought me back to a couple of modules where we usually start and finish the modules in a circle. And we do a checkup of where we are at that moment in time. And most of us will say, okay, I do feel like an imposter sometimes, and I felt out of place. And you reminded us that we're not alone. And it's about the learning, acknowledging that feeling that we can be on the top of our game and have that feeling when we're growing, when we're exposing ourselves to new learning opportunities. It's like we're learning and you're learning this, but you need to try and you need to acknowledge your feelings at this moment, but we're learning. So I was thinking how this can be applied to everyday life. And I have a 13-year-old daughter myself, Natalia, and I usually talk about her with those same principles. It's like you're learning and you're being exposed to new things. And it's part of the learning process where you've experienced different feelings, but we're in this together. We're always learning. And I think that is very profound how this research and your findings can be applied to everyday life. So I've loved the conversation, and I have one final question. I love to collect practical advice. I love to collect pearls of wisdom. So what's the best advice that maybe you have received, or a piece of advice that you usually give to others as your best pearl of wisdom?
So usually I like to focus on this question of balance, of sort of trying to be the best professional that you can be and trying to be the best mother and wife that you can be. And it's an age-old question. I think all of us struggle with that on some level. And this is actually a piece of advice that somebody gave to me that I have really shared with others because I found it so valuable. And sort of what they were saying is you never want to measure your success on a daily basis, because if you do that, you will find that you are coming up short in one way or another on almost every single day. So for example, there were days last week, I mentioned our new associates were starting, and those required really long days from me in the city. I live about 40 minutes from New York City, more with traffic most days, unfortunately. And so if I looked at any one of those days last week, I would really feel like the balance was out of whack. My kids were just starting school again, and here I am spending 12 or 14-hour days in New York City away from them at a time where they have a lot of questions and school is new and all of this stuff. So if I'd measured any one of those days, I would have come to the conclusion that I was not doing what I needed to do, that I was failing in some way as a parent. But you can look at another day and feel exactly the same. I am taking off of work, even though all of this stuff is happening at work that's important and needs my attention. My daughter has a doctor's appointment, and I know that it's really important for me to be present for this particular appointment, or she's playing in the state championships and I need to watch that game and she needs me there. So if you look at it on a day-to-day basis, you can really feel like you're coming up short. And that's because on a day-to-day basis, we are making those decisions, like what today is my priority. And you have to give and take a little in both directions to make everything work, right? To do the best that you can in all of those domains. But if I sort of zoom out a bit and I look at it on a 6-month basis or a yearly basis, or even eventually the entire course of my career, I think I feel much, much better about how I'm doing. Then I can see when I'm zoomed out that I have been present at key moments at work and I have been present at key moments with my family. And I feel much better about the overall arc of that story and my own sort of attempt to find balance. So it isn't the day-to-day. I would say zoom out and don't give yourself a hard time if there is a rough day or 2 or 3 in there in one direction or another. Just trust the process. Trust that if you are always thinking about things and trying to prioritize what you really feel needs your attention. When you do that 6-month or 1-year slice, you're going to feel a whole lot better. So that would be my advice to any working mother or parent who is trying to find that balance that is sometimes feels very elusive, but is possible in my view.
So very powerful reminder that life is both a succession of small sprints, but also you need to figure out what the whole marathon looks like. And it's looking at the short term, but in the long term as well. So Milana, thank you so much for your time. This has been truly inspirational and motivational. So for anyone who would like to contact you or follow your work, what's the best way to do so?
Well, thank you, number one, for hosting. You're such a lovely host, and you made this so easy for me. So I really enjoyed this conversation and really happy to find another way to connect with the Penn students. It's a program that always holds a super, super special place in my heart for sure. For people who want to connect with me, I think LinkedIn is the easiest way to do that. Mention in the note that you're part of the Penn program. If it isn't otherwise indicated on your profile, we'll immediately accept anybody who is part of this program is a friend. We share something in common. We've all had that shared experience. And you said it several points during the podcast, and I could not agree more. This is a real transformative program, and anybody who is in it or considering it would be incredibly lucky to be a part of it. I would not be where I am today in my own sort of psychology or in any measure of professional success had I not done this program. So I remain incredibly grateful. And for that reason, really want to help anybody who is either beginning this journey, thinking about this journey, any of those things. My door is always open. I'm always happy to chat and to offer any help that I can in any capacity.
So this was great, but it's a wrap. Thanks again, Milana, and thanks to everyone for joining another episode of the Practitioner Scholar, a Penn Chief Learning Officer podcast. Until the next time.